C.S. Lewis had written something along the lines of, when you find that you're off track, the best thing to do is to go back to the last time that you knew you were on the right path and then get back on the right path.
This podcast is brought to you by BJU Press Homeschool. Homeschooling is an exciting adventure we take with our children. One of the most challenging parts of this journey is choosing the curriculum you want to use. BJU Press Homeschool is a curriculum you can trust. All the books, resources, and videos have been designed with you and your child in mind. Their curriculum is educationally robust and rich, taking into account that children have different learning styles, strengths, and needs. Mom, you are in charge. BJU Press Homeschool is here to come alongside and support you. Do you need help with the teaching load, or is there a subject you just don't want to teach? Their amazing video courses are available for all grades and almost every subject. BJU Press Homeschool believes that homeschooling can produce a new generation of students who know God, love their neighbors, and stand firm in their faith. For more information, go to bjupresshomeschool.com. That's bjupresshomeschool.com. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Zan Tyler podcast. I'm your host, Zan Tyler. Let me take just a minute to ask you to please subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen. And if this podcast has been encouraging to you, please leave us a review. Each review really helps us. I also want to remind you that we are on YouTube now, so you can see the interviews that I have with our amazing guests. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, where we also post interesting content. I'm excited to have Jim Mason as our guest today. Jim became the president of HSLDA in 2022 after serving as vice president of litigation and development for 7 years. He's also a very talented and creative writer and has penned many of the most popular articles in Homeschool Legal Defense's Homeschool Court Report magazine. Jim also serves as a board chairman of parentalrights.org. Jim and his wife Debbie live in Stevenson, Virginia. They have 7 children and 4 grandchildren. The Masons homeschooled all of their children through high school. In his spare time, Jim is an avid bird watcher. I think you will really enjoy Jim's story of how he ended up becoming a lawyer and eventually became a lawyer with Homeschool Legal Defense Association. His work at HSLDA is a calling and a mission for Jim, and he is devoted to serving homeschooling families across the country. Welcome, Jim. Well, today, I'm so honored to have Jim Mason with us. Jim is the new president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and HSLDA is now celebrating their 40th anniversary, which is hard for me to believe. So, Jim, thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Well, thank you, Zan. It's my pleasure.
And so first, before we start talking about the homeschooling world, tell us how you and your wife, Debbie, decided to homeschool.
So Debbie and I, when we were engaged, Debbie told us that we were going to homeschool when we had kids.
Well, that's good. That's a good way to start.
So, I mean, there was very little decision-making process in my head or on my part. But truly, she said that she had gone to school and was a certified public school teacher. And by the time we got engaged, she was actually teaching and coaching at a community college in our state of Oregon when we first got engaged. And she just expressed a very strong desire to, if we had kids or when we had kids, to be able to raise them up outside of the public school and be able to, really raise them in our Christian faith. And so I honestly had never really thought about homeschooling. I don't know that I had ever heard of homeschooling. I was a single guy and I'd worked in kind of, the military and trucking companies and construction. And it just wasn't something that I thought about or talked about with anyone ever. And so I was a little, dubious about it. Grew up in the public schools and just hadn't given it much thought, but she expressed a really strong desire. And so over the next few years, I started looking into it, and I think I got sold on the idea for 2 reasons. There were 2 critical things. When we were engaged, we were so I had been in a Bible study, and then we got married and she joined the Bible study. And we have been praying for this couple who worked for an engineering company, and they were off in Cairo for a prolonged period with their family. And so we were praying for this couple, and at that time, I think 2 children. And when they came back and joined the Bible study, Debbie and I, by that time, were married, and they homeschooled. And so they were the first homeschooling family that I ever encountered. And their oldest daughter, whose name is Leah Garber, was, I think, 7 at the time. And so
that was Leah Garber's family. Oh, that's interesting.
So that was a really big influence on me when, and we had our first child about a year after they came back from Egypt, I think. And just getting to know them and seeing up close and personal and getting to know, watching how their children were developing, and just the sweet spirit. And Leah Garber.
Yes, I know Leah.
So John and Olga Garber were really close friends of ours in Oregon. They moved to Virginia. Then I went to law school, and they were instrumental actually in introducing me to Mike Ferris to help me get this job. And Leah, who was 7 when I met her, has worked at HSLDA longer than I have. So she was already working here. And she's now our director of membership something. She's a pretty high up person here now.
She could have probably started working there when she was 12. She's such a bright, articulate person.
Yeah, she is, and she's really one of our key people here. And the second thing that really helped me was when our oldest child Luke was maybe 4. Debbie signed us up for a program called the Writing Road to Reading. Now, I'll never forget it. So I took a couple of days off from work.
That.
You did it?
Yes, I did.
Wow.
That.
Yeah. Well, so she roped me into it. I was really excited to go, and we went to this seminar. I think it was 2 or 3 days, and it just was so such an exciting and attractive way to teach kids that really, I was really sold on it. So by the time Luke was ready to start learning to read, we'd had I had an actual teacher who had done this further training, and it just was a natural fit for us.
So how many kids do y'all have in all?
We have 7 children. They are all grown up now. Our youngest child, Abby, is 20 years old and is off to college.
Boy, can you believe how the time flies? It just flies.
It just flies by. So earlier this week, my oldest son, his wife just had their 4th child. So as soon as I don't want to cut the podcast short in any way. So don't worry. But as soon as I'm done with you, I'm getting in the car and driving down to about 3 hours from here to visit my new grandson, Teddy.
Oh man, that is awesome. Well, I do feel a little bit bad that this kept you from going earlier this morning, but thank you for being here. Especially, thank you.
But if just when I need a favor from you next time, just remember that.
I will. You call anytime. So Jim, one of my favorite memories with you and Debbie was when we were at a national conference, right, and you and Debbie and Joe and I and the Smiths from Louisiana and the Thorntons from Tennessee ended up having a big dinner together one night. I mean, just in some restaurant, nondescript restaurant somewhere. I have never laughed so hard in my life. It was so much fun, but we also had some great serious discussion. And Mike Ferris had already told me that you had a real life before you became an interesting life before you became a lawyer. Not that being a lawyer is not interesting, but tell us a little bit about what you did before you became a lawyer and then how you got into the law.
Okay. I went to college at Oregon State University, and I had a Naval ROTC scholarship. So after college, I spent 4 years on active duty as an officer in the Navy in San Diego on a ship. I became a Christian while I was at college, and I think I was 20 years old. I made a profession of faith, was baptized in the Willamette River, and kind of got on track until I graduated from college, and then I went off to the Navy, and sort of I didn't ever abandon the faith or ever think I was not a Christian, but I didn't live according to the things I knew I should. And so I kind of gradually drifted away from the faith and church, and always in the back of my mind, knowing that it wasn't a good path that I'd chosen. So on active duty, after active duty, I got a job with a Fortune 500 company, and I was in an operations management track, and started in that direction. After a couple of years, that just really wasn't working out, and from a job perspective it was, but from a faith perspective it was not. And I felt very strongly that I needed to get my life back on track, and in the process, it just became clear to me that I'd read, I'm not going to be able to quote it, but C.S. Lewis had written something along the lines of, when you find that you're off track, the best thing to do is to go back to the last time that you knew you were on the right path, and then get back on the right path. So a man who was very influential in leading me to the Lord in the first place lived back in where I went to college, and he was actually one of my military advisors when I was in the ROTC program, and we had become friends. He and his wife had really opened their home to me, and I got to know their young children. And so I moved back there to be close to them, to try to get back on track. And weirdly, they were very close friends with a person named Debbie Strom, who eventually played a significant role in my life. And so because I was trying to get back on track, my whole focus, my whole purpose was to find my way back. And the Lord led me through some different things. I had a cover story. My cover story was, I'm going to quit this job. It was a great job with a good company, a good future, and go back to Oregon State to get my MBA, because that's the ticket. I'll get an MBA. And that was a good cover story because, people in my circles wouldn't have understood why I was really doing it, but getting an MBA made some sense. So I took classes, about right up to the date when you had to withdraw, or, you could get some money back if you withdrew. And I just got to the point of, I'm not here to get an MBA. I'm here to get back on the path. And so I pulled out of school and got a job stacking Christmas trees on the side of Mary's Peak in the Coast Range. Just really, really started over. I was really a joyful time. It was kind of weird because I was, out working in the woods in Western Oregon, and in that time of year, it's very wet and cold. And I was working at the Holiday Tree Farm, which was the biggest Christmas tree plantation in the world at the time. So it was a big operation. And eventually, Christmas season was over, and a guy at the church had a 3x5 card on the bulletin board looking for a construction laborer. I don't know anything about construction, but so I pulled the card off the bulletin board and ended up framing houses and putting up cedar siding for the next 3.5 years. And that was the season in which Debbie and I got married, and we had our first kid while I was still a carpenter. Then after that, with one child, and in those days, the housing market and timber market, weren't very strong. And so I needed a better job to support my family. And so the way I usually tell the story is, I spent a year in jail, followed by a year on house arrest, followed by 5 years on probation. Which is true enough. I was looking for just about any kind of job that would be better, I'd be better able to support my family. And the first job that I got was with the sheriff's department, and went to jail for a year. So And I guess I was a parole and probation officer, and in 1991 or 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the Navy decided it needed my services again. I was still in the reserves, and I went to the Middle East, and I had a pretty exciting job. It was fun. It was kind of behind the, I wasn't a combatant. I was in logistics, and I traveled all around the United Arab Emirates and Qatar and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia as a liaison officer with local port officials. And I guess the way it always has seemed to me is we had a good life where we were plugged into our community, our church. I had a job that was interesting and fun and in a smaller, town. But when I came back from the Middle East after I was released from active duty, just really felt like the Lord was wanting me to look at bigger horizons. That eventually led to discovering Regent University and its law school there, which rekindled kind of a lifelong interest in going to law school. So we went off to law school with our 3 kids, and our 4th child was born the year I graduated from law school.
So, Jim, you have been on all sides of the law. I mean, you've been the person who could take homeschoolers to jail if you wanted to, and now you're the person who keeps homeschoolers out of jail.
Yeah, so I was never a peace officer. I did work as a parole and probation officer, though. I did work an awful lot with CPS during that, where we had mutual people that we were supervising.
And that gives you such that gave you such an innate understanding of CPS in a lot of ways that other people may never have.
Yeah.
So you went to law school. Did you go to work immediately for HSLDA?
No.
When you graduated?
So this is another aspect of this story. I was working as a parole and probation officer, and this opportunity to go to law school kind of appeared, and some really interesting, amazing things happened to make it possible for us to go. And I told people at the time that, I wanted to go back to law school so that I can go to work for this outfit out in Paonian Springs, Virginia, that helps homeschoolers. And we had started getting HSLDA's materials and reading about the cases. I remember one time I used to be fit and trim and worked out every day, and I was working out with the elected district attorney in our county, and he was also a Navy Reserve officer. And I was telling him about this, and he said, "Look, one thing the world doesn't need is more lawyers, but it especially doesn't need any more crackpot lawyers." So if you're going to be a lawyer, be a prosecutor. So I wrote Mike Ferris a letter at the time, and I said, "Hey, great news. I've been accepted to Regent University School of Law, and when I get done, I'm going to be ready to come work for you to save the world for homeschool freedom." And he wrote me back a really polite letter that said, look, he basically agreed with the DA. It was like, there's not very many lawyers that can do this work, so maybe you should keep your day job. So then when I graduated, I wrote another letter, and this time I got a response from Mike Smith, and he said, "Oh, well, good job. Great. He did well in law school, and unfortunately, we still don't have a job for you." So I went off, clerked for an appellate court, and then I went to work for the General Counsel of National Right to Life Committee and worked in kind of a free speech practice for, I think, 3.5 years with him. And that brings Leah Garber back into the story, because they had since moved to Virginia, and they were going to the same, so Leah was working here, and they went to the same church as Mike Ferris. So one day, they were on vacation. They stopped at our house in Indiana where I was working for the National Right to Life Committee guy. And we started talking about it. I said, "Yeah, I'd still love to, but, they just keep telling me no. So I guess, HSLDA is never going to happen. But I'm doing fun stuff, and it's a great practice and interesting law. And it had a good purpose." About 3 or 4 months later, I get a call from John on Sunday, and he says, I just came from church. I saw Mike Ferris, and he said their litigation guy just turned in his notice, and they're looking for a guy who can do litigation, which is what I was doing. And so I emailed my resume to John that Sunday, and the rest is history, as they say. That was in 2001.
Well, I know you are a great litigator because Mike Ferris told me that the first time he was introducing you to me. You weren't there, over the phone, telling me about this new litigator, and he told me about your law enforcement background. He called you a tough cop, actually, is what he said, and that you were a great litigator. So, well, as you enter the presidency on the 40th anniversary, and I've been listening to your podcast with Mike Ferris and Mike Smith. It's really good. I just haven't had a chance to finish it, so I'll finish that later today. Tell us what your vision is. I mean, I've always heard when the founder or the founders, in this case, of an organization leave and a new president comes in, it sort of marks a new era for that organization. But I see this as such a seamless transition because of your heart and your background and your years at HSLDA. So what is your vision, Jim?
Well, we live in interesting times, Zan. You know, the history of homeschooling in America, beginning with your story, intimately involved. You know, you were a really prime example of the fight for homeschool freedom in the early days. Involved state officials who basically just didn't think it was legal at all. And so the early fights tended to be around state laws that required teacher certifications and things like that. And so the early days were kind of expanding the boundaries of freedom from it's widely thought to be illegal, and maybe actually is illegal in many states, to today it's unquestionably legal. Everybody knows they can homeschool if they want to, that it's a lawful opportunity. And so then in the middle of all that, so there's this big transition, but there's still, there's lots and lots of homeschool families, and, there's, I think, 13,000 school districts in America, something like that. You would be surprised how many, state officials, school officials still want to kind of, run roughshod over homeschooling families, and that crops up all over the country at different times.
That's right. I see it all the time.
Yeah. So that's a lot of what we do. But then this amazing thing happened, on the one hand, tragic, and on the other hand, it's just changed the world of education so much. And that was the COVID pandemic. And so what COVID did was, in a new way, brought so many more people into the ambit of private homeschooling that maybe never would have done that before. And so the enormous growth amongst families who are homeschooling just over the last 3 years has created new opportunities and new challenges for us in the homeschooling world, including a lot of people, who are now homeschooling. You'd be surprised how many people, so we did our job maybe too well. A lot of people say, well, homeschooling's legal, so I'm just going to go homeschool, without really realizing that there are still laws.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So we help a lot of people get their, if they skip a couple of steps, we help them get back into line on the legal, requirements.
So you wrote this great article for the court report. I've got it right here. I've been dissecting it. I love the cover. So if you're watching this on video, you get to see the cover. And it's called How a Haircut, a Hair in a Used Bookstore Saved This Article. I love this article, Jim. You are an amazing writer. And I don't say that loosely because I worked for a publisher in Nashville and as an acquisitions editor. So I've seen a lot of bad writing, and this is really good writing. But you talked about how HSLDA had 20,000 contacts in 2022. Now, is that contacts from families or legal contact stuff going on?
Yeah. So as I say in the article, so we get phone calls, emails, and any manner of communication, any means of communication. People calling us either with questions or problems. So a lot of them are kind of more routine, just questions like, so many of the new homeschoolers just really don't know what are the legal requirements and what does it mean that I have to keep a portfolio and that kind of thing, simple sort of questions. A big chunk of the kind of questions we get today as the homeschooling movement has matured and now homeschooled kids are homeschooling their kids. There are still official, employers and state officials who don't treat homeschool diplomas as valid. I mean, it's surprising. The joke that we've had here for years is that it's easier to get into Harvard than it is to get into hairology schools.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. No, it's a joke, but not a funny joke.
It's not a funny joke.
It's sort of ridiculous joke, isn't it?
It's true. And so a lot of trade schools don't treat a homeschool graduate as, the same as they tell, fully capable. We've had it so ridiculous that we've had people who have actually completed the course of instruction and done really well, and they won't let them sit for the licensing test because their homeschool diploma, they need to get a GED to take the test for the class that they've done really well in. So we still work on those kind of questions a lot for homeschool graduates. And then we still get a fair amount of, legal emergencies from these 13,000 school districts all over the country, and CPS investigations that are, and we're dealing with one right now. I just can't even believe that it's happening. It's a, do you have a minute?
Yes, I've got a minute.
So a mom from a different country, right? She lives in a different country, is thinking about moving to one of our United States. And this United State has a homeschool law. So this mom from a different country writes to the school district where she's thinking about possibly moving to and says, I homeschool in my foreign country. And I'm just curious, what do I have to do if I move to your United State and want to homeschool? And she ended up deciding not to move. But the superintendent turned her into CPS for educational neglect because she never filed her homeschool paperwork. And so we're dealing with a CPS investigation, and they won't drop it. Zan, they won't drop it. We're up to supervisors and lawyers, and they still won't drop it. And the woman lives in a different country.
Okay. Yes. And
I did not make this up.
Yeah, no, I know. You can't make this stuff up. And I think in your article you said there's something like that you monitor all these state agencies because you have to. I mean, our threat might not be like front door outlawing homeschooling, but they're always trying to come in on the periphery and just regulate us to death to make homeschooling so miserable nobody will want to do it. And boy, that's a great example. It's so ridiculous.
Yeah, and it's such a waste of time for the officials and stressful.
Well, our tax dollars at work, right?
Right. And it's sad to me because we deal with less. This one is obviously so egregious that it just kind of baffles me. But we deal with that on a regular basis where we can, in common sense world, it would be easy to resolve a lot of things, but in officialdom and bureaucraties talk, it's hard often to resolve even easy to resolve things. And so we still deal with a lot of those kinds of issues all over the country. Another big issue. So go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, tell about the one in New York. I mean, this was fascinating for me to read about, where you had the woman, who they totally messed up on her record keeping. And then y'all ended up having some agreement where the New York City School Board or somebody had to report to y'all.
Yeah. So this is in New York. New York has a regulation for homeschoolers that was adopted before the invention of email. That's how antiquated it is. And so the regulation, it's just kind of stupid. I mean, it says if you want to homeschool, you've got to send your notice to the school district. Then the school district is supposed to send you a form, and it's all in the regulation. It's you mail in and they mail you back, and then you fill out your home education plan, and then you mail it back to the central office, and they have so much time to do stuff with it. And if Anyway, so New York City had long been kind of a prime example of a bureaucracy that didn't match the resources that it needed to deal with the number of homeschoolers that it was handling. And so what happened is Tanya Acevedo, a single mom living in New York City on Manhattan, the island of Manhattan, wanted to homeschool. And so she withdrew her child in the middle of the year to homeschool. She went to the public school that he attended, formally withdrew him. She turned, she mailed off the right paperwork to the right people at the right time. And she gave a copy of that. So she had to mail it to the central office for homeschooling on 7th Avenue in Manhattan. We've dealt with it so often, I can tell you the address. And she gave a copy to the school that her child had attended, and she had formally withdrawn him from, right? But the rules were that until the central office on 7th Avenue in Manhattan turned off the attendance record of the child at the public school in the computer, the public school just kept marking the child absent. And so because the bureaucracy at 7th Avenue was so behind, they didn't do their part. They were supposed to mail her back stuff, but they never did. So after 30 days, the school automatically counted the kid as habitually absent and turned her over to social services for educational neglect. So a CPS investigator shows up at her apartment, even though she had done everything the law required of her, and it was the central office of homeschooling on 7th Avenue in Manhattan that hadn't done what it was supposed to do. So we have been dealing with that for years and years and years, and most of the times it didn't turn into a big dramatic thing like this. But so they made two mistakes, right? They sent CPS out to her house, and it was after hours, and I was the on-call after hours attorney that day. And I don't know. I just said, we got to do something about this. And so we sued then Mayor Bill de Blasio and all of the New York City public school bureaucracy and said, you guys got to fix this. This should not have happened to this woman, and it's happening to all these other people. So they eventually agreed to a consent decree where they had to clean up their act. They had to provide more resources to the Central Office of Homeschooling and not turn people over to CPS who didn't deserve to be, turned over to CPS. And they had to report to us quarterly for 2 years to demonstrate that they were in compliance with the order. So, yeah, so New York City has, it's still kind of a mess, and the old antiquated regulation still is in existence, and it's still not great, but they stopped doing what they did to Tanya.
No, that is amazing. Thank you for listening to part 1 of our 2-part episode featuring Jim Mason. Be sure to tune in next week to hear part 2 of our encouraging conversation. And as always, you can visit me at zantyler.com for more information. See you later.